Hello, today I will be discussing my research project, a waveform biomechanical analysis of prosthetic and intact limb gait in above-knee amputees. My name is Olivia Miller, and come with me as I describe this project. So to begin, we need to understand what a lower limb prosthetic is. In this project, I may also be referring to it as an LLP, or a lower limb prosthetic. But these are to replace someone's lower limb. These tend to be at the ankle length, below knee, or above the knee. Above the knee can range from directly above the knee to right below the hip. But lower limb prosthetics are extremely beneficial because they allow people more mobility, especially people with birth defects and various accidents or later in life health problems who are missing a portion of their leg, to have more independence and have an improved quality of life. However, lower limb prosthetics, or LLPs, have various shortcomings. Particularly, there are biomechanical challenges. There are frequent complications, people do not walk properly, and there are various health-related complications that come from these lower limb prosthetics not being calibrated correctly. It often leads to discomfort, pain, and exacerbates phantom limb syndrome. Additionally, it complicates the quality of care that a patient receives. So this project will be aiming to understand gait differences between healthy and prosthetic patients, to understand gait differences to further guide prosthetic development. So to begin, I want to introduce you to some terminology that I will be referring to throughout this project. A lower limb prosthesis or prosthetic device that I've referenced so far, LLP. Next, I'm going to be discussing ground reaction force. As someone takes a step, so imagine that this is the ground, and they take a step, the amount that they're pushing on the ground, and therefore that it's pushing back up, is referred to as the ground reaction force. That will also be demonstrated on here with GRF. Next, I will be talking about motion in 3 different planes: vertical, so that's up, down; anterior, posterior, so that's front, back; and medial, lateral, so that's side, side. Additionally, I will be discussing a waveform analysis, which is the type of data that I collected on my project. This is simply showing the data through various waves and graphs, as I'll explain further into my project. And next, an important terminology is healthy versus intact. Healthy is a patient with no complications of any sort, and intact is someone who has 1 remaining limb and 1 prosthetic limb. So someone who's completely healthy has 2 fully intact regular limbs, and someone who we're going to be referring to in this project as intact has 1 completely healthy intact limb and 1 prosthetic limb. So for my research, I used a public data set of, it's cited on the screen here, and it includes 14 patients who are, as we categorized, intact. So they have 1 prosthetic leg and 1 regular leg, and there are 20 healthy subjects to compare them to. So the healthy subjects have no prosthetics of any sort here. I'll move my camera so that you can see it a bit better, if I can. No. Yeah. So here, as shown, there are 14 patients who have intact limbs and 20 without. So for each of these patients, the data provided de-identified data with a number for each patient. The K level, so that's the intensity of their injury. For all of these, since they have substantial parts of their leg missing, they have a higher K level, and the ground force reaction quantities in various planes. For this project, I used Google Sheets and manual calculations to show my work. So ground reaction force we have to understand is, again, the push-off force when someone takes a step. So when someone steps, first their heel hits the ground, and this is the first hump that we see on the screen, and as they step, the middle of their foot is on the ground, so this is the mid stance, and there's not as much ground reaction force. And lastly, their toes and the ball of their foot push off, and that's the second hump of the ground reaction force graph. So this tends to be described as a double hump model. So first, I will be describing the joint movement in the gait cycle. Here we have people who are completely healthy. These are the 20 healthy patients. And then for the intact patients, we have their intact leg and the prosthetic leg, as shown here. So for healthy patients, we see a double hump pattern, similar with the intact leg, though there are some discrepancies in the intact leg. However, this data indicates that for the prosthetic leg, there is a lot of missing information, and it shows that the prosthetic leg has very little capability to have varied joint movement across the gait cycle, hence we don't see a double hump pattern. Next, the ground reaction force that I calculated for between healthy patients and the prosthetic leg versus between healthy patients and the intact leg shows that during especially 50% of the gait and at the beginning, so typical points where we would see the initial contact and then the push-off, there's discrepancies between the intact limb and the prosthetic limb. This data shows that at those critical points, the prosthetic limb is doing extremely little work, and therefore the patient is required to do additional work with their intact leg, showing discrepancies in the capability of the prosthetic leg compared to the intact leg. So this is a key area of research that needs to be developed further, is impacting the vertical push off with the prosthetic leg, especially at 50% of the step. Next, I will be discussing the ground reaction force with the anterior and posterior plane. So this is forward and backward. Again, it shows that at approximately 50% of the gait, so 50% of the way through, there's an extreme discrepancy between the intact leg and the prosthetic leg. The prosthetic leg isn't doing an ample amount of work, and therefore that has to be compensated for by the intact leg, showing a key area of research needed. Some suggestions are improved joint and push-off force. However, this is a key area of research. Lastly, I will be discussing the medial lateral, so side-to-side movement of intact versus the prosthetic limb. Now, this data is inconsistent with some of the data that we've seen earlier. However, this shows that in many cases, the prosthetic, especially between approximately 15% and 40% of the gait, the prosthetic limb is moving more side to side than could be anticipated from a regular limb. This is showing that the prosthetic limb isn't as precise and therefore isn't as stable for the patient. And then also at 50%, we see this key critical point where the intact limb has to overcompensate for the discrepancy in the prosthetic limb, exerting a huge amount of effort in comparison. Overall, this data shows that there are some inconsistencies between intact and prosthetic limbs, indicating need for a higher level of research and development in the gait, specifically around the 50% mark. However, there were some limitations of this work since my work was a secondary analysis study. I have no control over the data collection, the materials, or the type of prosthetics used. While I did my best mathematically to normalize the data, there's still some inconsistency, and that is beyond my control. So for future work, that would be something to look at. For future work, I would also want to look at a larger data set, a variety of prosthetics, and a more comprehensive view of other measures to better compare the patients. However, overall, this work shows key areas of improvement on prosthetic limbs. Thank you so much. Have a great day.